He looked at her then, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through. And then you and Pearl moved into my world, whether I liked it or not. Jessica leaned back, letting his words sink in. Maxwell, I didn't move into your world. We've been here all along. You just decided to open the door. His gaze dropped to his hands. It scared me. Still does. Because now I care what happens to you both. And caring means... He trailed off, unable to finish. Caring means risk, she finished for him. But it also means connection. And that's worth more than safety. He let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. You make it sound easy. It's not, she said simply. But it's possible. You've already started. You're here with us. You've been there for Pearl. That's choosing to care, Maxwell, whether you admit it or not. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Jessica saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to carry years of weight, and she thought of what she had told him about Pearl, how she hadn't planned to be a mother, but once the child was in her arms, there had been no other choice but love. You know, she said softly, love doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes broken, and you have to rebuild it. That's what I did with Pearl. And maybe that's what you're doing with us. Something in his eyes shifted then. Not a full smile, but a loosening, a recognition that he'd been seen completely. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, but I want to try. Nurse Jessica Oyemi moved quietly through the dim apartment, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the tiled floor. The only light came from the muted lamp in the corner, casting a warm, honey-colored glow over the living room. On the couch, 4-year-old Pearl was curled up like a kitten, eyes drooping as the cartoon on the TV flickered on. You didn't wait up for me, did you? Jessica whispered, setting her handbag on the small table by the door. Pearl's face lit up instantly. I was awake, but I was tired. Jessica smiled, scooping her into her lap. The scent of baby shampoo and faint vanilla still clung to Pearl's hair. These moments, quiet, safe, just the two of them, were what kept Jessica going through the endless rotations at the hospital. Being a single mother meant she wore every hat: nurse, cook, comforter, disciplinarian, and storyteller. Balancing it all was exhausting, but it was her choice, her pride. Living in this estate in Lagos was one of those decisions she never regretted. The streets were lined with manicured hedges, security guards patrolled day and night, and the air felt cleaner here than in most of the city. Most residents kept to themselves, but in a friendly, polite way, an occasional wave when passing at the gates, or a quick greeting during morning jogs. It was why she noticed immediately when the vacant apartment 2 doors down came alive with the thud of heavy boxes and the buzz of movers. New neighbors. For the next few days, she caught glimpses of him, a tall man with a controlled stride, his gaze fixed ahead as if the world around him didn't exist. He never smiled, never paused to chat with the security men, never so much as glanced at anyone. Pearl had asked once, "Is he nice?" And Jessica, being honest but tactful, had answered, "We don't know yet." 2 evenings later, after a rare early shift, Jessica found herself in her kitchen, pulling out flour, sugar, and cinnamon. Baking was her mother's legacy to her, a way to say welcome without words. She decided to make cookies, the soft, chewy kind Pearl loved, and maybe they'd be the start of something neighborly. Pearl, perched on a chair by the counter, helped stir the batter and stole a few chocolate chips when Jessica wasn't looking. "Will he like them?" Pearl asked. "He should," Jessica replied with a smile. "Who doesn't like cookies?" When the cookies cooled, she placed them neatly in a tin lined with wax paper. She dressed Pearl in a clean yellow sundress, tied her curls with a ribbon, and together they walked down to the new neighbor's door. Jessica knocked gently. After a moment, the door swung open. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark t-shirt that somehow looked expensive. His face was striking but hard, his eyes sharp as if measuring them in seconds. "Hello," Jessica began warmly. I'm Jessica, and this is my daughter, Pearl. We just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. She lifted the tin slightly. We baked you some cookies. What do you want? His voice was clipped, almost bored. Jessica blinked at the abruptness, but kept her tone light. As I said, we just came to— I don't want them, he interrupted, and I don't do visits. Please leave my porch. The words hit her like a splash of cold water. For a second, she was too stunned to reply. She felt Pearl's small fingers tighten around hers, sensing the tension. All right, Jessica said finally, her voice steady. Have a good evening. They turned away, Pearl glancing back in confusion. He doesn't like cookies? She whispered. Jessica didn't answer. She was too busy pushing the sting down where Pearl couldn't see it. Not everyone was friendly, and that was fine. Back in his apartment, Maxwell Adeoye closed the door with a quiet click, leaning against it for a moment. His chest was tight, not from guilt, but from the unwanted echo of a memory. A warm kitchen, a woman with laughing eyes sliding a plate of cookies toward him. That woman had been gone for 2 years now. Just like everyone else he'd ever loved. He didn't owe the world anything, least of all small talk. His life was a schedule. Rise early, bury himself in CEO duties, come home late, and keep to himself. People meant attachments, and attachments meant loss. He told himself he was doing her a favor by keeping his distance. But Jessica noticed him anyway. Even if she avoided thinking about it, her eyes caught him walking to his car in a flawless suit each morning, returning late at night with a face that looked carved from stone. The estate security greeted him. He never replied. The grocery delivery boys tried to chat. He signed receipts in silence. He was a ghost in a living man's body. One evening, as she folded laundry in the living room, Jessica found herself glancing at the tin of cookies still sitting on the counter. She hadn't the heart to eat them or throw them away. Pearl had already forgotten the encounter, her world full of crayons and picture books. But Jessica, she still felt that flicker of indignation. Why bother being that rude? Still, she reminded herself, she didn't have the time or the energy to fix anyone else's life. She had Pearl to think of, hospital shifts to survive, and bills to pay. So she decided he could keep his solitude, and she would keep her peace. In the apartment 2 doors down, Maxwell sat in the half-dark, his dinner untouched. He heard faint laughter through the walls, Pearl's giggle, followed by Jessica's gentle voice reading a bedtime story. He told himself he didn't care. But something about the sound settled into him like a splinter. He thought of the little girl's curious eyes and the way she clung to her mother's hand. Then he turned away, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. He had no idea that fate was already winding a thread between their doors, one that even his walls wouldn't be able to keep out. The afternoon sun in Lagos was unrelenting, hanging low and heavy in the sky, casting a golden haze over the estate's quiet street. A light breeze carried the faint scent of bougainvillea from the hedges, but it did little to ease the heat. 4-year-old Pearl sat on the front steps of her apartment, her small backpack resting beside her feet. Her legs swung in the air, hitting the step below in an unhurried rhythm. She had arrived home from school earlier than usual, dropped off by the familiar estate school shuttle. Jessica wasn't home yet. She had taken an extra shift at the hospital, one she'd reluctantly agreed to when another nurse called in sick. Normally, Pearl's sitter, Mrs. Chaik, would have been there to receive her, but the older woman had been called away for a family emergency. Jessica had assured herself she'd be back in time. She wasn't. Pearl didn't mind much at first. She had learned to wait. She traced little circles on her backpack, hummed a song from school, and watched the shadow of the hedge inch across the pavement. That was when Maxwell Adeoye passed by. He was walking back from the parking lot, having returned from an early meeting. A navy blue suit jacket hung loosely over his arm, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up just enough to reveal strong, tan forearms. His dark eyes swept over the steps, almost out of habit, until they landed on Pearl. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Hello," she said brightly, as though they'd been friends all along. Maxwell hesitated. His instinct was to nod, maybe grunt and keep walking. He didn't do conversations, especially not with neighbors' children, especially not with this neighbor's child. But something, maybe the sun's glare, maybe the sight of a small child alone on the steps, made him stop. "You're sitting out here alone?" he asked. "Yes," Pearl replied cheerfully. "I'm waiting for Mommy." Maxwell glanced toward the door, then back at her. He didn't like the idea of her waiting out here unattended. In his mind, a dozen possibilities played out, none of them good. "I'll be back," he said shortly. Pearl blinked up at him. "Okay." He walked into his apartment, muttering to himself, "This is not my business." Still, his hands moved on their own, reaching for the half-full pack of cookies from his kitchen counter and pouring cold water into a cup. Minutes later, he returned and placed the items beside her. "Thank you," Pearl said politely, tearing open the cookie packet. She held it out toward him. "Want one?" Maxwell shook his head and sat down beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the steps. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Pearl turned to him, cookie crumbs on her lips. "Why are you always sad?" The question was so sudden, so unfiltered, it caught him completely off guard. "I'm not sad," he replied automatically. "Yes, you are," she said, as if stating an obvious fact. "You don't smile, even when people say hello." Maxwell looked away, his jaw tightening. No one, not even adults, dared ask him things like that anymore. But here was a little girl watching him with open curiosity, no judgment in her gaze. Before he could think of an answer, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. "Pearl!" Jessica's voice carried relief and panic in equal measure. She came into view still in her pale blue nurse's scrubs, her hair slightly mussed from the long shift. She dropped to her knees, checking her daughter over. "Are you okay? Why are you outside?" "She just got here before you," Maxwell said, rising to his feet. Jessica looked up at him. "Thank you for keeping her company." His expression hardened instantly. "You shouldn't leave a child sitting out here alone. Anything could have happened." Jessica blinked, taken aback. "I know, I don't want to hear it," he cut in sharply. His tone wasn't raised, but it carried the kind of edge that could slice through an apology. Without waiting for her to finish, he turned on his heel and strode back to his apartment. Jessica straightened slowly, the sting of his words settling in. She had been about to thank him properly, but now, she simply took Pearl's hand. "Let's get inside, baby." That night, as Jessica tucked Pearl into bed, her daughter spoke up. "Mommy, Mr. Maxwell gave me cookies and water." Jessica paused, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. "That was nice of him. And I asked him why he's always sad." Jessica froze, then chuckled softly. "You didn't." "I did," Pearl said, yawning. "He said he's not sad, but I think he is. He doesn't smile much." Jessica kissed her forehead. "Good night, Pearl." But as she left the room, she found herself wondering about the man next door, the one who seemed to live behind locked doors and sharp words. Why was he so closed off? Meanwhile, in his own apartment, Maxwell poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. Pearl's question replayed in his mind like an echo. "Why are you always sad?" He thought about giving her a real answer, that some wounds didn't heal, that losing everyone you loved could turn you into a shell of a man, but he pushed it away. She was 4. She didn't need to know about grief that deep. And yet her voice lingered. The innocence of it. The certainty. For the first time in years, Maxwell found himself unsettled, not by boardroom crises or billion naira deals, but by a child's honesty. He had told himself he didn't want connections, but maybe, just maybe, that belief was starting to crack. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made every movement feel heavier. In the quiet of his apartment, Maxwell Adeoye lay on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling. His head throbbed in sync with his pulse. His muscles ached, and heat radiated from his skin as if a furnace burned inside him. He'd been feeling off all evening. Dull headache, sore throat. But now the symptoms had escalated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, soaking into his t-shirt, and his breath felt shallow. He tried to swing his legs over the side of the bed, but the room tilted dangerously. He hated this feeling. Helplessness. The rational part of his mind told him to get in the car and drive to the hospital. But the moment he tried standing, his knees nearly buckled. There was no way he'd make it. And then came the thought he didn't want to have. Jessica. She was a nurse. She lived just 2 doors down. She was his only option. Maxwell clenched his jaw. Asking for help felt like swallowing broken glass. But pride was a luxury he couldn't afford tonight. He pulled on a pair of sweatpants, shrugged into a hoodie, and grabbed the wall for support as he shuffled toward the door. The corridor outside was silent, the faint hum of the estate's generator in the distance. He raised his fist and knocked on her door, 3 slow, heavy thuds. Inside, Jessica stirred from a half-sleep on the couch. She'd fallen asleep in her scrubs, too tired to change. The knock jolted her upright. At this hour, her first thought was Pearl asleep in her bedroom. She padded quietly to the door, peering through the peephole. Maxwell. He was hunched slightly, one hand braced against the wall, his skin pale under the porch light. Even through the tiny glass, she could see the sheen of sweat on his face. Jessica unlocked the door. What happened? Fever, he rasped. It can't. He stopped, swaying slightly. Come in, she said quickly, sliding an arm around his back to steady him. He was heavier than he looked, his body radiating heat like an oven. She guided him to the couch. Sit, don't move. Jessica moved with brisk efficiency, fetching her nurse's kit from the cabinet. She took his temperature, 40 degrees Celsius. Far too high. She pressed a cold compress to his forehead, then retrieved a packet of paracetamol from her kit and a glass of water. Take this, she instructed. He obeyed without protest, too drained to argue. Jessica worked in silence, her hands steady as she checked his pulse and breathing. The fever was bad, but his vitals were stable. He'd need rest, hydration, and medication through the night. When his breathing finally slowed and the tension eased from his face, she draped a light duvet over him. You'll be fine. Just sleep, she murmured. He was already half asleep, the lines of pain on his face softening. Jessica locked her bedroom door, not out of distrust, but habit, and returned to her own bed. She thought about how strange life could be. A week ago, this man wouldn't even accept her cookies. Tonight, he was asleep on her couch, too sick to stand. By morning, the couch was empty. The duvet was folded neatly on the armrest. There was no note, no trace of him, except for the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the room. Jessica wasn't surprised. It was exactly what she expected from Maxwell, disappear before anyone could make the moment matter. She brushed it off, focused on getting Pearl ready for school, and tried not to think about him. That evening, a knock came at her door. Jessica opened it to find Maxwell standing there, looking freshly showered and composed, though his skin still held a faint pallor. In his hands was a small wicker basket wrapped in clear cellophane, filled with cookies, crackers, and a bottle of apple juice. This is for you, he said. His voice was quieter than usual, without its usual bite. Jessica glanced at the basket, then back at him. You didn't have to. I did, he interrupted, though without his usual sharpness. For last night, I was out of options. She took the basket. You're welcome. And you're feeling better? Better enough, he said. There was a pause, like he was deciding whether to say more. His eyes met hers briefly before flicking away. Also, sorry for before. It wasn't much, but Jessica knew how difficult those words must have been for him. Apology accepted, she said softly. Something in his posture eased, just slightly. They didn't talk long. Maxwell wasn't the type for drawn-out conversation, and Jessica didn't push. But as she closed the door, she realized something had shifted. The sharp edges between them had dulled, just enough to reveal the possibility of something else. A truce, fragile but real. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the first time Maxwell had let someone in, even a little, in years. The estate was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that came after a light rain. A faint, earthy scent lingered in the air, mixing with the subtle perfume of the hibiscus bushes along the walkways. Jessica sat on the shared porch between her apartment and Maxwell's, a mug of tea warming her hands. Pearl had fallen asleep hours earlier, curled up against Jessica during a bedtime story. She'd carried her to bed, tucked her in, and lingered just long enough to make sure her breathing was slow and even before stepping out into the night for a few minutes of air. Maxwell emerged a moment later, as if drawn by the same impulse. He wore a plain black t-shirt and dark sweatpants, his hair slightly mussed, a contrast to the impeccable suits Jessica usually saw him in. He held no drink, no phone, just his hands shoved into his pockets. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the estate walls. Jessica was content to let the quiet stretch, but she could feel his eyes on her, as if he was working up to something. Finally, Maxwell broke the stillness. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica turned her head. "Depends on what it is." His gaze didn't waver. "Pearl, she's not your biological daughter, is she?" Jessica's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. She didn't often talk about this, not because she was ashamed, but because it was a complicated story, one most people didn't need to know. "Why do you think that?" she asked, keeping her tone even. "I've noticed things," Maxwell said carefully. "The way you talk about her, how you're always careful with certain words. It's none of my business, but—" He hesitated as if searching for the right phrasing. "I've been wondering for a while how you became her mother." Jessica looked down at her tea, watching the steam curl upward. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but laced with something deeper. "Pearl is my sister's child." Maxwell's brows drew together. "Your sister?" Jessica nodded. "My elder sister, Grace. She had Pearl when she was barely 22. At the time, she was not in a good place. She struggled with a lot: substance abuse, bad relationships, an inability to hold a job. One morning, she brought Pearl to me, said she needed me to babysit for the day." Her lips pressed together in a faint, almost sad smile. That day turned into 4 years. Maxwell leaned forward slightly, the shadows shifting across his face. "She just left." "Yes," Jessica said softly. "At first I thought she'd come back in a few hours. Then I thought maybe a few days, but she didn't. I called, texted, no answer. Weeks passed. I filed a missing persons report. Eventually I learned she was alive, just gone, living in another state with people who didn't care about stability." "And Pearl?" he asked quietly. "She was only 6 months old when Grace left her with me. She had no memory of her mother, no real concept of anyone else being in that role." Jessica's fingers traced the rim of her mug. "So I became her mother. Not because I planned it, not because I was ready, but because she needed me and there was no one else." Maxwell's throat felt tight. He could picture Jessica, barely more than a young woman herself, suddenly responsible for an infant. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the sheer will it must have taken to keep going. "Pearl believes you're her mom," he said, though it was more observation than question. "She does," Jessica confirmed, "and I'm not going to take that away from her. She's too young to understand why someone would leave her. When she's older, if she wants to know the truth, I'll tell her. But for now, love is what makes it true." Her words settled heavily between them, not as a defense, but as a simple, unshakable fact. Maxwell stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his chest. He'd known people who took pride in their bloodlines, their heritage, their family names. But this was a different kind of love, fierce, chosen. "You could have said no," he said finally. "You could have walked away." Jessica's eyes met his. "I couldn't. She was just a baby. She needed someone to feed her, hold her, keep her safe. If I'd said no, I'd have spent the rest of my life wondering what happened to her." Maxwell looked away, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. He thought of his own life, of how loss had hollowed him out, of the people he'd loved being ripped away by fate. Here was someone who had stepped willingly into a role most people would run from. For the first time in years, he felt something like admiration stir in him. "She's lucky," he said finally. Jessica smiled faintly. "I'm lucky too. Pearl changed my life. She made me grow up faster than I planned, taught me what it means to put someone else first. She's the reason I pushed through every exhausting shift at the hospital." Maxwell nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her profile as she looked out into the night. He realized he wanted to be part of that world she'd built, not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged there. He didn't say it out loud, not yet. But in the quiet of his own mind, Maxwell made a small promise. "I'll be in their lives." That night, as they both sat in companionable silence, the boundaries between them felt less rigid. The porch no longer seemed like neutral ground. It was something shared, a space where truth could live without judgment. Maxwell didn't know it yet, but the conversation had planted a seed, and seeds, given time, have a way of growing into something that can't be ignored. It started with small things. A late shift for Jessica, a short text from her Pearl's school bus is delayed. "Can you?" And Maxwell, without hesitation, found himself waiting at the school gate. The sight of Pearl's eyes lighting up when she spotted him was disarming. She ran into his side like she'd been doing it all her life, chattering about her day as if she had no doubt he would listen. From then on, it became a pattern. If Jessica's schedule ran late, Maxwell was there, leaning against his sleek black SUV, Pearl's backpack slung casually over his shoulder. He didn't make a big deal of it, didn't stay for long after dropping her off. Just a brief nod to Jessica, sometimes a faint smile before retreating to his own apartment. Jessica, in turn, found herself leaving small offerings on his doorstep. A plate of rice and stew wrapped in foil, a slice of banana bread Pearl insisted he had to try. Sometimes she'd knock and wait for him to take it. Other times she'd just leave it there, knowing he'd find it. They exchanged emergency numbers one evening after a sudden blackout hit the estate. "Just in case," Jessica had said, handing him a scrap of paper with her contact written in neat handwriting. Maxwell entered it into his phone without comment, but that night he saved it under Jessica Pearl. A quiet rhythm began to form between them. Some mornings, Jessica would spot Maxwell at the small estate grocery store, pushing a cart with purposeful efficiency. Once she caught him slipping a pack of Pearl's favorite chocolate biscuits into his cart alongside his usual coffee and bottled water. Other times, Pearl would knock on his door in the late afternoon with a drawing she'd made. He'd accept it with a puzzled kind of gratitude, as if unsure what to do with the colorful mess of crayons and hearts. Later, Jessica noticed the drawings pinned neatly to his refrigerator door. Evenings in their apartments took on a strange synchronicity, lights switching on at almost the same time, the faint sound of Pearl's cartoons drifting into the corridor, followed by Maxwell's low chuckle when she knocked to invite him to watch just one episode. The change was gradual, but the neighbors noticed. The same man who once stalked past without so much as a glance was now seen walking hand in hand with a little girl to the school bus stop. The woman who'd once kept to herself was now exchanging quiet porch conversations with him in the evenings. Whispers began to circulate in the compound, soft speculation about whether they were a couple, about the way he bent his head when speaking to her, about how she smiled more now. Jessica ignored the whispers. She wasn't interested in explaining herself to anyone. Maxwell didn't hear them, or if he did, he didn't care. It was Pearl's school art day that shifted something inside him. Jessica had invited him almost in passing. "You don't have to come," she'd said. "It's just a small exhibition the kids put together. But Pearl would like it if you were there." He told himself he was too busy. But on the day, he found himself driving to the school, walking into the brightly decorated classroom with its walls covered in paint-splattered paper and macaroni collages. Pearl spotted him instantly. "Maxwell!" she shouted across the room, her voice ringing with pride. She tugged him toward her art display, a simple drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. Above it, in her careful handwriting, she'd written, Me, Mommy, and Maxwell. He stared at it longer than he meant to, his throat tightening unexpectedly. You like it? Pearl asked, her eyes wide. I do, he said quietly. Very much. Jessica stood nearby, watching him with a look he couldn't quite read. That night, Maxwell sat on his couch, staring at the drawing Pearl had insisted he take home. It was taped above his desk now, the first personal item in years that hadn't been related to work or loss. Something about it stirred a protective pride he hadn't felt since, ever really. Not like this. Not toward a child who wasn't his, but who somehow, without his consent, had claimed a place in his guarded world. The weeks that followed only deepened the quiet bond between the three of them. Some evenings, Maxwell stayed for dinner. He'd help Pearl with her homework, his deep voice patient as he explained sums and spelling words. Jessica would watch from the kitchen, pretending to focus on washing dishes, but secretly memorizing the sight of his head bent close to Pearl's, the way she beamed when he praised her. Other times, he'd call Jessica from the store. Do you need anything? I'm here already. She'd list a few items, milk, bread, sometimes fresh fruit, and when he arrived, she'd find extras she hadn't mentioned tucked into the bag. Jessica realized with a mix of surprise and caution that Maxwell was no longer just a neighbor. He was part of their daily life now, woven into the small, ordinary moments that made up their days. One Friday evening, as the three of them sat on the porch eating ice cream cones, Pearl leaned against Maxwell's side and sighed happily. I wish we could always do this. Jessica smiled. We can when we have time. Pearl shook her head. No, I mean, always, always. Like forever. Maxwell glanced at Jessica, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Neither of them replied to Pearl's wish out loud, but both felt the truth of it settle in. By the end of the month, Maxwell's once rigid schedule had shifted in ways he hadn't thought possible. There was room now, room for a little girl's drawings on his fridge, for shared meals, for evenings on the porch talking to a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing. Healing, slow and stubborn, had found its way into his days, and though he didn't say it, he knew. He wasn't going back to the way things were before. The estate had its own way of carrying whispers. They didn't come as direct confrontations. They floated through morning greetings, lingered in the glances exchanged by women chatting at the communal garden, and slipped into conversations with the security guards. Maxwell heard them first. Passing two residents near the gate, he caught a fragment. Always with her, the little girl. He didn't slow his stride, but the words lodged in his mind. Jessica felt it too. In the supermarket aisle one afternoon, she overheard two women murmuring about the nurse and the CEO as she compared prices for cereal. She ignored them outwardly, but her jaw tightened. It wasn't shame, just the irritation of knowing people were assigning labels to something they didn't understand. Maxwell's world outside the estate wasn't much kinder. At the office, the quarterly report had revealed a projected downturn, and investors were pressing hard. Board meetings stretched late into the night. The constant hum of his phone and the clipped tone of his assistant's updates left him with a permanent tension in his shoulders. Jessica was in her own spiral. The hospital had been understaffed for weeks, and double shifts were becoming the norm. The constant stream of patients, the pressure to stay alert, and the emotional drain of being the one to deliver bad news to families, it was wearing her thin. They saw each other less in those weeks, but when they did, it was in fleeting moments. Maxwell dropping Pearl at the door with a quiet, "She's home." Jessica leaving a container of stew on his counter while he took a business call. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening. Jessica was still at the hospital, sorting through charts, when her phone buzzed. It was Maxwell. "Jessica," he said without preamble, "Pearl's not well." Her pulse spiked. "What happened?" "She's warm. Fever. Says her head hurts." Jessica was already grabbing her bag. "I'm on my way." When she arrived, Pearl was on the couch in Maxwell's apartment, a blanket around her shoulders and a glass of water on the table. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes glassy with fever. Maxwell stood nearby, his posture tense. "No, I didn't want to overstep," he said quickly, "but I called the clinic. They said to bring her in. Good, Jessica replied, crouching beside Pearl to check her temperature with the back of her hand. We're going now. Maxwell drove. The streets were a blur of headlights and honking horns, Lagos traffic at its most unforgiving. Jessica sat in the back with Pearl, murmuring reassurance and rubbing her small hand. Maxwell's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. At the clinic, the diagnosis was quick. A viral infection, nothing dangerous but enough to spike her temperature. They were given medication and instructions for rest. Back at the estate, Jessica settled Pearl in bed. Maxwell lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable. You stayed with her until I got here, Jessica said quietly. She was scared, he admitted. She asked if you'd come, and I didn't know how to. I just stayed. There was a pause. Jessica met his eyes. That's what being present means, Maxwell. Not just when it's convenient, when it's messy, when it's uncomfortable, when it scares you. Something in his gaze flickered. And if I can't, then you need to decide, she said firmly. Presence or distance, not both. She can't be halfway important to you. Neither can I. The words hit harder than she intended, but she didn't soften them. She'd seen too many people drift in and out of Pearl's life already. Maxwell's hands curled into loose fists at his sides. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward Pearl's room, where the faint sound of her breathing carried into the hallway. I'll choose presence, he said finally, his voice low but certain. Over the next few days, he proved it. He came by to check on Pearl after work, sometimes bringing small treats, a coloring book, her favorite fruit juice. He stayed to help with her medicine, listened to her recount the plots of cartoons, and even learned how to braid her hair under Jessica's amused supervision. Jessica noticed the change, but she didn't say it out loud. Words weren't what mattered here. Consistency was. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Pearl play quietly with her doll, Maxwell broke the silence. I used to think needing people was weakness, he said, that if you kept your world small enough, nothing could hurt you. And now, Jessica asked. He glanced at her, then at Pearl. Now I think, I might have been wrong. Jessica didn't push him for more. Some admissions didn't need to be dissected. The whispers in the estate didn't stop, but they no longer mattered. The company pressures eased slightly after Maxwell secured a new investor. Jessica got a week of lighter shifts, enough to breathe again. And in the middle of it all, their small, intertwined household carried on, steady, present, and more connected than either of them had planned. The rain that night came softly at first, tapping on the estate's rooftops like a polite visitor. By the time Jessica stepped onto the porch, it had grown heavier, a steady rhythm against the concrete and the hibiscus leaves. She had made tea, chamomile for herself, black for Maxwell, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Pearl had gone to bed early, still recovering from her fever. The apartment was too quiet without the hum of her chatter, so Jessica welcomed the sound of Maxwell's door opening. He stepped out in dark slacks and a plain gray sweater, his hair slightly damp from a quick shower. When he saw the extra cup on the low table between the chairs, one corner of his mouth lifted. Expecting me? Jessica sipped her tea. Let's just say I had a feeling. They sat without speaking for a while, the rain filling the space between them. Jessica could sense there was something on his mind. His gaze kept drifting to the wet street, his hands flexing against the mug. Finally, he said, You know how you told me about Pearl? How she isn't biologically yours? Jessica turned to him, cautious. Yes. He nodded slowly. That stayed with me, not because I doubted it, but because of what it meant. You chose her. You made a life around her. That's rare. Jessica's brow softened. Maxwell, what's this about? He exhaled, his breath visible in the cool night air. It's about why I am, the way I am. He told her then, halting at first as if the words might cut him. He was 24 when the accident happened. His parents, younger brother, and the family driver were on their way back from a weekend at their countryside property. Maxwell had stayed behind for a meeting. The call came just after midnight. A trailer had lost control in the rain. There were no survivors. "I remember the silence in the hospital corridor," he said, his voice low. "The kind that doesn't just mean quiet, it means absence. An entire part of my life gone in one moment." Jessica listened without interruption, her tea cooling in her hands. "For a long time, I didn't feel anything," he continued. "I worked. I built the company. I filled my days so there was no space for the nights. And then I met Adora." His mouth softened briefly at the memory. She was the first person who saw past the CEO face. She had this way of making everything feel lighter. We got engaged 2 years later. I thought maybe I'd found my way back to living. Jessica could already sense the turn in the story, but she let him speak it. "She died suddenly. Brain aneurysm. One minute we were planning a weekend trip, the next I was holding her in the ER, knowing she was gone." The rain filled the silence that followed, heavier now, a steady curtain around the porch. "I didn't want anyone close after that," he admitted. "Not friends, not family I barely had left, and definitely not neighbors. I thought if I kept my circle empty, I couldn't lose anything again." He looked at her then, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through. "And then you and Pearl moved into my world, whether I liked it or not." Jessica leaned back, letting his words sink in. "Maxwell, I didn't move into your world. We've been here all along. You just decided to open the door." His gaze dropped to his hands. "It scared me. Still does. Because now I care what happens to you both. And caring means—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Caring means risk," she finished for him. "But it also means connection. And that's worth more than safety." He let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said simply. "But it's possible. You've already started. You're here with us. You've been there for Pearl. That's choosing to care, Maxwell, whether you admit it or not." For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Jessica saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders seemed to carry years of weight, and she thought of what she had told him about Pearl, how she hadn't planned to be a mother, but once the child was in her arms, there had been no other choice but love. "You know," she said softly, "love doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes broken, and you have to rebuild it. That's what I did with Pearl. And maybe that's what you're doing with us." Something in his eyes shifted then. Not a full smile, but a loosening, a recognition that he'd been seen completely. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, "but I want to try." "That's all anyone can ask," Jessica replied. The rain eased into a soft drizzle. Maxwell set his mug down and leaned forward slightly. "Jessica, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If I ever messed this up, if I pulled away again, would you let me back in?" She thought about it. "If you're honest about why, maybe. But I won't let you drift in and out of Pearl's life. She's not someone's temporary comfort. If you're here, you're here." Maxwell nodded slowly, accepting the terms without protest. When they finally said goodnight, Jessica watched him walk back to his apartment. He moved more slowly than usual, as if each step was a decision. She realized that tonight wasn't just a confession, it was a turning point. And for the first time, she believed that Maxwell wasn't just in their lives because it was convenient. He was here because he wanted to be. The Saturday morning began the way Jessica liked them to, slow, unhurried, and wrapped in the smell of fresh pancakes. Pearl sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs and humming, a streak of flour across her cheek from helping stir the batter. Maxwell had stopped by earlier than usual, bringing a bag of fresh fruit and insisting on making the coffee. It had become a routine on weekends. He'd slip into their morning like he belonged there, because by now he did. Jessica was flipping the last pancake when a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't Maxwell's usual 3-rap knock, and it wasn't the estate security's polite tap. It was hesitant. "I'll get it," Maxwell said, already moving toward the door. Jessica glanced over her shoulder and froze when she heard a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. Is Jessica here? She turned fully, spatula still in hand. Standing in the doorway was Grace, her sister. Grace looked different, healthier. The glassy-eyed haze Jessica remembered was gone, replaced with a clearer gaze. Her clothes were simple, clean, but there was still a restlessness in the way she shifted her weight from foot to foot, as though she might bolt if she stayed too long. Grace, Jessica said slowly. Pearl's head popped up from the table. Who's that? Jessica stepped forward quickly, positioning herself between them. Pearl, sweetheart, go wash your hands. The pancakes are ready. Pearl, sensing the change in her mother's tone, obeyed without question. Grace's eyes followed the little girl as she skipped toward the bathroom. There was no flash of maternal claim in her gaze, just a faint, unreadable sadness. I'm not here to take her, Grace said, almost before Jessica could speak. Jessica crossed her arms. Then why are you here? I'm sober now, 9 months clean, Grace said, her voice steady but low. I've been through rehab. I'm in a program. Part of it is making amends. Jessica didn't answer immediately. Years of resentment pressed at her throat, demanding release. She remembered the morning Grace had dropped off the baby for a few hours and never returned. She remembered the unanswered calls, the messages left in desperation, the nights pacing the floor with a feverish infant and no one to turn to. I wanted to say thank you, Grace continued, for raising her, for being her mom when I couldn't. I know I wouldn't have been any good for her back then. Jessica studied her sister's face. There was sincerity there, and regret. But there was also distance, as if Grace had already accepted that motherhood wasn't hers to reclaim. You could have called, Jessica said finally, her voice quiet but edged with years of hurt. You could have visited, even once. Grace looked down. I was ashamed, and I was gone. You don't know what I was then, Jess. You wouldn't have wanted me around her. Jessica's jaw tightened, but the anger that had kept her company for 4 years felt different now. Not gone, but looser, like a knot finally starting to give. So what happens now? Jessica asked. Nothing, Grace said simply. I'm not ready to be a mother. I don't know if I ever will be. I just needed to see her, to know she's okay, and to tell you, you're doing better than I ever could have. Jessica felt Maxwell's quiet presence just behind her, like a steadying wall. She realized she wasn't bracing for Grace to snatch Pearl away. She wasn't bracing for anything. You can see her, Jessica said finally, but not today, and not without me there. She thinks I'm her mom, Grace. That's not going to change unless she decides she wants to know the truth one day. Grace nodded, her gaze dropping again. I understand. They stood in silence for a moment, then Grace glanced toward the kitchen. You're doing good, Jess. Really good. Jessica's lips curved in the faintest smile. Yeah, I am. Grace left without asking for a hug. Jessica watched her walk down the path until she disappeared beyond the estate gate. Back in the kitchen, Pearl was already halfway through her second pancake, syrup smeared at the corner of her mouth. Maxwell leaned against the counter, watching Jessica with that unreadable, steady look he had. You okay? He asked. Jessica exhaled slowly, setting the spatula down. I think so. I've carried that anger for so long, Maxwell, and now I just don't have space for it anymore. Letting it go doesn't mean it didn't hurt, he said gently. She met his eyes, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I know. They ate in a comfortable quiet. Pearl told a long, winding story about a dream she'd had, Maxwell listening with a small smile. Jessica watched him, the way his gaze softened when Pearl spoke, the way he reached over to wipe syrup from her chin without thinking. And somewhere in that quiet, Maxwell pushed his chair back, stood, and walked into the kitchen. Jessica, he said, his tone calm but certain. She looked up. Yes. He didn't kneel, didn't make a show of it. He simply leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets, and said, "Marry me." Her breath caught. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated. "No big speeches, no ring right this second. I'll get you one you deserve. But I want this. I want you, and I want Pearl to be mine in every way that counts." Jessica stared at him, her heart thudding. "Maxwell, I'll start adoption proceedings as soon as you say yes," he continued. "So when we tell her, when she's ready, she'll know I didn't just love her in my heart. I made it official." Jessica's throat tightened. She glanced toward the table where Pearl was now humming to herself, completely oblivious to the moment unfolding. "You're serious," she whispered. "Dead serious." She swallowed, her eyes stinging. "Then yes." Maxwell's shoulders loosened, and for a brief moment, the guarded CEO was gone, replaced by a man whose whole face lit with quiet joy. Later, after Pearl was in bed, Jessica stood at the kitchen counter, Maxwell beside her, their hands brushing. "You know," she said softly, "I think Pearl's going to love calling you Dad." Maxwell smiled faintly. "I think I'm going to love hearing it." And in the stillness of that kitchen, with the smell of syrup still lingering in the air, Jessica realized something. The family she had wasn't the one she'd started with, but it was the one that had chosen each other. The air in Lagos that afternoon carried the kind of warmth that felt like blessing rather than burden. Inside the small courtroom on Broad Street, sunlight streamed through tall windows, settling like gold on the polished wood benches. Jessica stood in the front, her hand resting lightly on Pearl's small shoulder. Pearl's hair was pulled into neat braids, tied with pale yellow ribbons, the same shade as the flowers in the bouquet Jessica held. Maxwell stood beside them, his suit perfectly tailored, but softened by the faint smile on his lips. He wasn't the kind of man who smiled often, but today was different. The judge peered over the papers before him, glasses perched low on his nose. "Maxwell Adeoye," he read, "you understand that adoption is a permanent commitment, carrying the same legal rights and responsibilities as biological parenthood?" Maxwell's voice was steady. "I do." "And you wish to adopt Pearl as your legal daughter?" "I do," Maxwell said again, his gaze flicking briefly toward Pearl. She was grinning at him as if she already knew the answer. The judge turned to Jessica. "And you consent to this adoption?" Jessica's throat tightened, but she found her voice. "Yes, absolutely." A few more formalities. A signature here, a stamp there, and then it was done. Pearl Adeoye. The name rolled through the air like a promise. Outside the courthouse, Pearl skipped between them, holding both their hands. "So I'm really yours now?" she asked Maxwell. "You've been mine in my heart for a long time," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Now it's just official." Jessica watched them, her chest full in a way she hadn't thought possible years ago. She remembered the lonely nights with a baby who wasn't hers by blood, the fear of not being enough. And now here they were, complete by choice. 2 weeks later, their wedding was small, intimate, and perfect. It was held in the private garden of the estate, under an arch of white roses and soft fairy lights. Jessica wore a simple, elegant gown. Maxwell, a navy suit with a cream tie. Pearl walked ahead of Jessica, scattering petals, taking her role as flower girl and daughter very seriously. The vows were short, but rich with meaning. Maxwell promised to choose them, always, every day. Jessica promised to let him in, even when her instinct was to guard herself. When they exchanged rings, Pearl clapped so hard her petals scattered across the grass. The apartment didn't change much in structure after the wedding, but it felt different, brighter. The once tidy living room now held a shelf of Pearl's books, a basket of dolls in the corner, and a framed family photo on the wall. Jessica in the middle, Pearl on her lap, Maxwell standing behind them, with his hands resting on Jessica's shoulders. The most noticeable change was in Pearl's bedroom. The door, once plain, now had a polished wooden plaque with her full name carved into it. Pearl Adeoye. Jessica had surprised her with it one Saturday morning, and Pearl had traced the letters with her finger, smiling so wide her eyes almost disappeared. Life settled into a rhythm again, but this time it was fuller. There were still late nights at the hospital for Jessica and long board meetings for Maxwell, but now they came home to each other. On Maxwell's business trips, he video called Pearl every evening to hear about her day. On Jessica's night shifts, Maxwell made sure Pearl's homework was done and her bedtime story read. The porch became their place, the same spot where Jessica had once stood awkwardly holding cookies and where Maxwell had once told her to leave. Now it was where they ended most evenings together. That evening, the three of them sat there as the sun slid toward the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the street. The estate was quiet except for the distant laughter of children playing and the low hum of the generator. On the small table between them sat a plate of warm cookies Jessica had baked earlier. Pearl reached for one, biting into it with a satisfied sigh. "These are even better than the first cookies you made for Mr. Maxwell," she announced. Jessica laughed softly. "Well, I've had more practice since then." Maxwell took a cookie himself, his gaze shifting to Jessica. "You mean since you tried to make friends with a man who had no idea what to do with kindness?" She gave him a mock glare. "Exactly. And look how that turned out." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Better than I ever imagined." Pearl leaned against Jessica's arm, already halfway through her second cookie. "Can we always do this?" she asked, her voice muffled by crumbs. Maxwell looked at Jessica, and they both smiled. "Always," Jessica said. The streetlights began to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the quiet road. Inside their home, toys waited in the corner, books waited to be read, and tomorrow's routines waited to be lived. But for now, they stayed on the porch, three people who had found each other not through chance, but through choice, through small acts that had built something unbreakable. And as the evening deepened, Jessica realized that everything she had once feared losing had been replaced with something better, a family whose name was now on the door, and whose love was carved into every part of their lives.